Welcome to our webinar, Powerful Low-Code Integrations with Frends iPaaS. I'm Sikko Brakema, Marketing Manager at Visma Connect. I will take care of the practicalities of this webinar and shortly introduce the speakers, Asmo and Nando. But first, we start with some housekeeping announcements. Due to the COVID measures, we are not in the office or in a webinar studio. Light, sound, and images are not as good as you might expect. On the right-hand side, you see some tabs. The chat tab is public. Anyone can post in the chat and the messages are visible to anyone. The questions tab is for questions to the speakers. Questions can only be answered by speakers and moderators. And I will handle the questions part of this webinar. I will inform the speakers when there are questions. Urgent questions will be answered as soon as possible, and the other questions will be answered during the Q&A at the end of this webinar. Now the housekeeping is done, it's time for me to introduce the speakers of today. And I'm very proud that they found time in their agendas to be here with us. I start with Asmo. Asmo started in 2010 as an integration consultant at HiQ, the mother company of Frends. Asmo is now the Vice President and Director of R&D at HiQ. Frends is well known for the many integration projects and clients at, amongst others, utility companies, financial services companies, and many government agencies. Nando is currently a product manager for integrations at Visma Connect. Previously, he worked as a team and tribe lead at our integrations unit. Nando managed integration projects at the Dutch government, financial services industry, and at IT and software companies. And now, without further ado, I will hand over the word to Nando. Nando, take it away, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think we can move to the next slide here. And well, first and foremost, welcome everyone. We want to we organized a webinar because what we see in the market and also with our partners and customers is that there is well an increasing need for integrations, and it's also necessary for that to keep being competitive. These integrations come in all sort of fashions, and synchronization applications are well different use cases every time. For example, we have some customers who move to a new cloud solution, but they still have some necessary or interesting data that the cloud solution needs to function properly. So for that, they need the integration to make sure that they get that data in a reliable way, and also in a secure way, of course. So that's one of the things we see happening. Another example is for instance, is a customer where they registrate their hours in our registration tool, but they also want to have the data to feed into their billing solution to make sure that the projects which the people worked on are also reflected in the billing they send to the particular customer which they worked for. And one of my favorite use cases is what I call the API standoff. And it usually goes that, well, two parties, they want to have an integration, and the first party goes, okay, well, we've got this beautiful API, please use it. And then the other party goes, yeah, we have one as well, and please use that. And then there's some silence and nothing happens because these integrations don't magically appear. Some work has to be done. But in other words, customers expect these sort of things now more than ever. They also want it in a fast fashion. So, and to facilitate that, and um, well, they need an easy to use solution, and it also has to be reliable. And that is where we found that Frends can help in these cases. And the Frends product, and together with Visma services, we can ensure that we solve these challenges for and together with you. And to showcase that to us and to share that, joining us today is Osmo, who's briefly introduced, and we prepared a demo for that, which Osmo is going to guide us through. So without further ado, Osmo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nando. And well, hello to everyone again. My name is Asmo Urpilainen, like all we already went through, and I'm the vice president slash head of R&D here at HiQ. So basically, I'm the man behind the platform in a sense. So I'm responsible for the platform development from a technical perspective, as well as, of course, the roadmap and everything and all things of that sort. And yeah, basically what exactly what Nando said. The idea for the webinar today is to kind of have a little bit of a look on the slides here first on what the kind of platform is all about. Basically, how does it work? How can you get it into use? And maybe a little bit of a kind of an overview of the most common or typical use cases we implement on the platform. And we'd like to finish the webinar with an actual demo of basically building a new integration from scratch to kind of showcase the actual low-code development process and, of course, all the related functionalities such as monitoring and things like that that are applied to the actually using the platform itself. But basically, I think without without any extra introductions from my side, we could actually jump into the matter at hand. And let's start here basically from the basics. So what is Friends in kind of the purest terms possible? So basically, Friends is a purely browser-based integration platform as a service. And what does that mean? That means that what we can do with Friends is basically implement any kind of API integration scenarios. So of course we can expose APIs on the Friends platform, and we actually have a full-on API management suite directly built into the platform itself. And of course we kind of apply all sorts of API design functionalities there, and of course we can consume other APIs as part of the integration processes themselves. But besides the actual APIs themselves, we of course do all the traditional integration use cases as well, starting basically from file transfers to data integration, system to system integration, and all the way to kind of full-blown business process automation use cases once you start combining all of these aspects together. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what Friends is and what it does. And of course, the whole ideology behind Friends is to be as effective and efficient and productive as possible when implementing these use cases. And there we basically apply a two-pronged approach. So we improve the efficiency and speed up the development by basically having that low code approach. And what does that mean in a practical perspective? Is basically the ideology that we have the sort of a library of pre-built integration functionality that you most commonly need in integration use cases, like data transformations or calling a system or, I don't know, validating data. All of these kind of normal functionalities that you need, we will provide for you out of the box. But of course, in real life, not everything can be solved purely out of the box. So that's why we have the low in front of the code there, meaning that we can actually extend any of the components quite easily in the user interface while developing. And of course, this will become quite apparent once we get to the actual demo portion. But developing new integrations is, of course, only half of the work, or oftentimes it's actually something like 10% of the total work you need to do, since, of course, you need to be able to then run and operate those integrations as effectively as possible once the development is done. And what we want to actually achieve there is that the Friends platform is automating all of the kind of modern, I would say, software development best practices directly into the development process itself, so that then the developers don't have to worry about this stuff. And this means, from a practical perspective, that we, of course, want to provide automated documentation generation from the platform, all kinds of monitoring and analytics capabilities, and all sorts of, let's say, unit testing and integration testing capabilities that we can automate and incorporate to the development process. Basically, version control and, of course, release and deployment management is automated and available. And all of these features and functionalities that you need to have in place to basically be as effective as possible, Friends provides for you out of the box automatically in the best possible way. And basically, of course, now that we are, let's say, an enterprise grade iPaaS, what that actually means is that then we want to bring the platform to you. And basically, what this means that the architecture behind Friends allows us to basically uh, develop these sort of hybrid and multi-cloud integration use cases, so we can actually bring the execution of the integrations even to your own local, let's say, data center if we are dealing with sensitive data, or we might have other information security or data security requirements. We can actually implement these sort of boundaries on basically where, which, and how what data is actually being processed. And maybe to elaborate on that a little bit further, so going to the next slide here about the architecture of Frends, so how the platform is actually built. And here we can see that basically we have kind of two main components that make up the Frends platform. And the first one is, of course, the control panel in the pink cloud in the middle of the picture here, where basically all development work, monitoring, rerunning of failed integrations, anything where a human needs to do some sort of perform some sort of a function or interact with the platform is centralized in that one single web application. And of course, there we can get all the nice benefits of operating in this sort of a software as a service model, so that everything is always up to date, and we can scale the cloud infinitely quite effectively and so on. But the key difference here to understand is that in that cloud control panel, we actually never execute any integrations, or we don't expose any APIs or perform any file transfers, but instead we attach what we are calling agents to that centralized control panel. And now the ideology is that the agents are actually the ones performing the integrations, running the integration code, so to speak. And now using this agent ideology, we can actually deploy that agent or remote integration runtime to whatever infrastructure the customer would like us to. So typically what we use this architecture for is to solve these sort of hybrid use cases where, let's say, your systems are located in an on-premise data center, but you want to, let's say, expose an API in the cloud. Or you might want to consume some data from a cloud system, but at the other end of the integration is then in a data center as well. So using the agent architecture, we can actually put those agents into the data center and the public cloud, and basically choose which parts of the integration are executed on which agent. And of course, the agents can now talk to one another using this same ideology and architecture as well. One key thing about the distributed architecture or the agent ideology is also kind of data privacy and ownership, like I mentioned previously. So if we have a use case that we're dealing with, let's say, sensitive data in the on-premise environment, now that we would have that agent capability there, we can actually guarantee that the data never has to leave the on-premise environment at all. So we can actually retain full control over where is my data at any given moment using this ideology and architecture. Perfect. But moving on here to maybe a little bit of a more functional example. So I have prepared this sort of an EDI invoice example for us to explain the kind of basic features and functionalities of the platform. So the first thing that you'll notice on the slide here is that, well, the slide is actually a little bit blurry to me, but hopefully you can make make out the picture and the process a little bit better. But basically what you can see in the picture here is a screenshot or an actual copy of an integration process on the Frends platform itself. And the first thing to notice here is, of course, that all integrations we develop on the platform, be they APIs or file transfers or scheduled integrations, all of them are described and developed using this globally recognized standard BPM and 2.0, so business process modeling notation. And basically, the main principles in creating this sort of an integration process is that we will, first of all, in the beginning of the process, define what we are calling a trigger. And the trigger is basically responsible for starting the integration when a certain condition has been met. And of course, what we could have as these sorts of triggering mechanisms could be, let's say, like we have in the picture here, an invoice file being sent to an API that Frends is offering, or let's say that the invoice file could be transferred to an SFTP server and Frends is actually picking up that file, or it could be a schedule, or we could actually poll a system and kind of make a determination, should we run this integration now or not. There could be queues. All of these various technical mechanisms that we can actually combine and control when the integration should actually be launched. And if we are in a situation now that, let's say that the integration has actually been started by the trigger mechanism, then it's up to the developer to define and develop the actual functionality of the underlying process. And the way that we do that in Frends is mainly using those 250 plus ready-made integration tasks. So I'm not calling them connectors because they are providing other functionality besides just pure connectivity to systems and data sources, because we can then, as you can of course see in the picture here, do all sorts of various operations like validating incoming EDI messages in this case, or converting conversions between multiple different data formats, and of course reading files, deleting files, and then of course that kind of traditional connector based connectivity to, for example, now send the invoice to an ERP system like we see in the picture here. And basically, what's left for the developer is to now orchestrate the order in which these tasks and integration functionalities are consumed and configure each step to basically do that exact functionality that's required by that integration. So in a common sense, for as an example, so let's say that we can see that we have the read invoice file step there as at the very beginning of the example process. What would be the configuration needed for that step is simply the location and name of the file that we are actually reading in. And now if we imagine that the developer is basically configuring these microservices or task steps and orchestrating in which order those happen, then the developer of course has an option to implement further logic in the form of decisions and maybe loops, error handling scenarios. We can of course branch out the execution into multiple parallel lines and do all of these kind of normal orchestration things and kind of capabilities that we need to achieve pretty much any integration use case we need, be it a file transfer or an ETL process. We still follow this exactly the same logic across the board. Brilliant. And now if we think that this would be the actual solution that we develop in Frends, and of course in a few moments in the demo we will see just that. A final thing to go through here on the slides is that now that the solution has been built, and of course we created that solution now in the control panel there in the cloud, but the actual execution of the solution would happen on an agent. So basically that whole integration process is now deployed to be executed on one of the agents. And once the agent, of course, starts executing that integration, we can have that visual basically representation of the process in real time, see how the execution for each instance of that integration is actually happening. So we have this sort of a fully visual message-based tracking system in place where we can, for each and every step that the integration is executing, see basically what went into that step or what went into that task, what was the configuration used, and of course now what's coming out. So let's say we are doing a conversion between an EDI file or an XML file and JSON. We can see the XML message going in, and then we would see the JSON message coming out. And this same functionality is now present for each and every step, basically resulting in this sort of a 100%, I would say, monitoring coverage for the integration solution itself. Brilliant. But then I guess the next step would be to actually skip over from the presentation here and jump over to screen sharing instead. So I'll actually start sharing my screen here, and sorry for the little bit of an echo that you noticed there. But basically, what I'd like to go through here is a little bit of a demo and presentation on the platform itself. So where are we actually now? We are now at one of our Frends tenants or deployment environments, as we like to call them, called demo.frendsapp.com. And basically, all of our customers get a dedicated Frends environment with all dedicated components, meaning that there is no mixing and matching of data between other customer environments, and you can always be sure that your data is isolated and secure on the platform itself. And in terms of what we can find here in the Frends control panel is various different views for example, developing APIs and managing the access control policies for APIs, the versions of those APIs, and basically a full-on API management suite under the APIs tab. But most interestingly, what we are going to be looking at today is the main integration catalog, or the process catalog, as you can see it here on the screen, where pretty much we always start using Frends from this view, regardless of what we are doing, because the main integration catalog here can be utilized to search and find various types of information regarding our integrations, which have been developed in our Frends here. So we could try and find, for example, integrations that are using a specific component or connecting to a specific system or utilizing a specific type of a message. And of course, we can access all sorts of governance and management functionalities relating to our integrations. So we can, of course, see the version numbers of of each and every integration, and perhaps manage the logging settings for each integrations regarding monitoring. And pretty much this is the place where we, for example, start the deployment process from the development environment to test and finally, of course, production at some point. But let's jump into creating a new integration, since that's what we are here for, and click on the Create New button, which basically takes us now to the process editor, which is now the main place where we basically do all of our development work. And the first thing that we need to do when defining or creating any type of a new integration is, of course, provide some initial information about that in the integration. So of course, what's the name of the integration? And in this case, it could be, let's say, int001. I don't know, this could be product information update. Could be our user scenario or integration scenario as an example here. And basically, we can, of course, control the versioning of this integration. So I'm going to set the major version to be 1 and the minor version to be 0. And of course, I could maybe provide some extra documentation or description on what my integration is doing here. And of course, the first step after providing that kind of basic metadata configuration would be to create the outline for my integration. So I kind of plan my work ahead a little bit as well when utilizing this sort of a Frends development logic. So if you remember from the slides, I mentioned that we always describe the integration in this sort of a process-based approach. That's actually a really important bit, or a really important piece of information to understand about Frends as well. That Frends kind of forces you to work in this sort of a process-based approach. And you will see why that's a good thing in just a moment, because typically what I like to do now is, before I go into any of the technical configuration, I can actually now just draw out what needs to happen by the solution. So typically I would do something like this. I would say that, all right, let's get the top, or let's say that get top 20 products from database. So if our integration use case was something like getting a product information from our product information management system, that would be, let's say, an SQL database, and then updating that product information to, let's say, some sort of a web shop interface could be a good example. So the first step should be getting out that product information from the product information management system. And if we're getting multiple products, so in this case, we would be getting, let's say, the top 20 products, I would now have to, of course, iterate or loop through each of the products. So I want something to happen for each product. So I'll just call the loop for each product found. And now the functionality that we would like to repeat for each of the products is, of course, insert the product to a, let's say, web shop. I'm bad at typing here. Web shop API. And then we close out the loop and, of course, the integration process itself. So now we have this sort of a working frame where we can start our development work. And basically what this means is that now that as we have the frame ready, we would now actually need to configure the first step, the second step, and of course the trigger mechanism for my integration here. So let's start from the first step. So if my task here now is to get the top 20 products from a database, now I would actually have to access that library of those pre-built integration functionalities that we need to basically implement that database query. And the easiest way for me to get there is simply to search through the library for example, SQL. And I can, of course, see that, hey, we found 4 different operations that are available for me to interact with an SQL database. So I'm going to pick the execute query option here today. And that now opens up the low-code configuration window where I can actually tell that microservice or tell that task what it needs to exactly do. And a good thing to note here, of course, is that all of our tasks and connectors are free and open source here on GitHub. So please go ahead and steal steal our connector code for your own use cases if you feel like it. But the important thing to kind of go through here is, of course, the actual configuration. So if we need to perform an SQL query and the SQL query task tells us that it wants the query itself, so the SQL query, it wants possible parameters, and then it needs to know what database it's targeting using a database connection string. So basically what we could do here at this point is directly just type out and write our SQL query. So this could be something like select top 20 star from sales lt dot product. So this is just a simple Azure SQL database that has the AdventureWorks database template there if you're wondering. And of course, besides the SQL query itself, we would have to now tell the component where the database is located. And here is actually our first chance to use the low-code functionality of Frends. So what we can actually do is put in double curly brackets, which basically enable the low-code functionality in any step that we are creating here on the Frends platform. And inside the double curly brackets, we are actually allowed to add in a hashtag which allows us to create references to all sorts of data and variables that we utilize as part of the integration flow here. So in this case, what I would like to add a reference to is actually to a feature called environment variables, meaning that we have a single centralized location now to manage these sort of connection strings or API keys or endpoint addresses and things like that. And of course, at the same time, what we are able to do is provide separate values for different active environments. So depending on which environment this actually integration is running, it would be able to target the correct database depending on the configuration we provide here. So that would be the initial first step that I need to do. And of course, now that I've kind of drawn out my process, I've implemented the first step, I of course want to know, does my configuration work? So that means that we could actually create a unit test and run that particular step of the integration directly here through the browser and kind of see that, yep, this is the result that we are getting back from the database. And a good thing to know here is that internally, all data is actually processed in a JSON format by the Frends platform. And the reason for this is now that we actually are quite happy with the result of our test. So we know that we can get the top 20 products into Frends here. And now we need to simply iterate through those products and perform the webshop API call. So of course, what I would need to do then is I would need to tell my loop that I want to now loop through all of the top 20 products that I'm getting from my database query here, and I want to access each product under a variable of product from within the loop. And finally, of course, we just need to do exactly what we did here for the execute query, but instead of targeting an SQL database, we might, let's say, perform a REST request and select the REST request connector with the link to the open source documentation as usual. And of course, the configuration looks slightly similar, but it's of course a little bit different since now we are working on the HTTP protocol instead of the SQL protocol. And of course, what I would need to do here, I could say that yes, let's do a post, and let's say we want to send the message to this sort of a testing service called httpbin.org, which is pretty much just this sort of a common testing, I don't know, service available in the internet that just echoes back whatever we send there. Because the interesting bit comes next. So now that we have our product data here, and I know that I can loop through each product, and I would like to send an update message with that product information to that httpbin.org service. What I could basically do is I could, for example, specify that the message I'm sending is XML. And let's say that our XML has a product element which has an ID element in it. Let's say we could have a color element. And finally, we could also have, let's say, size. And it could be, oh, hello? Oh, sorry about that. There was someone calling me from Netherlands, and I was sure it's going to be Nando and something is wrong, but apparently not. So let's just continue. So basically, and finally, we could also have something like, let's say, a date timestamp of the message that we are actually creating. So now what's left for us to do is provide just the low code configuration, so the mapping, so Frends knows which column or which attribute basically to pick into each field. And we do this in exactly the same way as we provided the connection string in the first step. So we put in those double curly brackets to enable the low code functionality, access the variables through hashtag, and under now result instead of the environment variables, we could actually now target the get top 20 products from the database, which could allow us to now directly pick up information from here, or we could actually now access the variable product which we defined in the loop here earlier. And of course, now what's left for me to do is simply just say that, yes, the ID is now coming from the product ID. The color is coming from, of course, color. So let's just copy that there and that there. So the color is coming from the color column, and size could maybe be just the size column like that. And just to make things interesting, we could, of course, also run any C# and .NET code directly within the double curly brackets as well. So I could do something like, let's say, write a little bit of a snippet here saying datetime.now.toString, and let's say I could grab the current date timestamp in a specific format here for my product. And also what we are allowed to do, of course, is any type of a data manipulation that C# and .NET allow us to do. So I could, for example, say stuff like, all right, so let's take the color first as a text or string, and now that it's in a textual format, let's replace the large capital G with an exclamation mark for whatever reason, if we wanted to have this sort of a data manipulation in place. And of course, the last thing that we would perhaps like to do on our integration here is say that, all right, now that we've successfully processed each of the products, I actually want to grab the product ID and actually send the product ID out from the integration as this sort of a variable or a promoted, let's say, monitoring variable, meaning that now we actually can search the executions using that product ID because we are spitting it out from the integration process. And finally, of course, I can just click create new process and activate it. Frends does it. Hopefully you can hear. Can you hear me at all? All right. So my headphones just died on me, but let's not let that bother us. Luckily, I had a spare. So getting back on track here. Now that we've actually saved our integration, what actually Frends is doing in the background is creating that first entry in the version control. It's of course automatically now deploying the solution to our development environment. And basically it's ready for us to now run and test it out in our real life scenario. Does it work?
So I'm just going to click the run once option here on the Frends UI, which now triggers the integration flow to run. So now we can see that it's executing, and that actually allows us to now jump into the monitoring view in the development environment for our nicely newly created integration. And of course, I could now see that yep, there's one successful execution between 16 o'clock in Finnish time and 17 o'clock. And of course, here in below, we can kind of see the access, or I would say the list of executions that the integration has performed. So what does this actually mean? And that by clicking on this particular row, I can actually jump into the execution itself and actually see that this particular run took 5 seconds. I started it manually from the user interface. And the first step of the integration was basically to execute this SQL query against a hidden database. So you remember the connection string was, of course, set as an encrypted parameter. So we're not, of course, showing that here. But this database query produced this set of product data, which we then iterate through in our loop. And of course, each loop has a single product in it. And of course, we could now find that particular execution of the loop that we are interested in. So let's take the long sleeve logo jersey here and see that in iteration number 9, what we did is used that product information that we are currently going through in the iteration to create a new message where we basically did our mapping of the ID, the color, the size, and then of course we generated the date time. We sent that over to this, or the HTTP bin testing service, and the response was basically HTTP code 200, everything is A-OK, and of course we can see the product here because the service is just sending back all the data that we are sending to the service. And maybe just to demonstrate here, finally, we could of course see that the first product that we processed had the colored green with the capital J letter there. And we can of course see that, yeah, here we replaced that with the exclamation mark. And just as a final kind of a piece of I would say demo here, you can of course remember that we now picked up the product ID from out of the integration process, and that's now available for us here in the monitoring view, meaning that now I could actually search through any of the executions, well, if I had more than one, and basically try and find a product where the ID matches. So I could search for 719, perfect, but if I go for 819, no executions, or if we go for, let's say, 711, was there something? Yeah, perfect. And now the ideology is that using this, we could actually now filter out and find exactly those executions we are interested in and start working with those. And just as a final bit of Frends functionality before we go into the Q&A here, what we can actually also do is if I go back in and edit my newly created integration here, and perhaps I, let's say, change the timeout to 40 seconds here and move this bit a little bit like that. So I basically made some changes to my integration. And once again, when I click Save Changes, we of course automatically get a new version here in the Frends version control, where we can of course even do a visual diff between those two versions. And I can even see that, yep, the change that I did was basically that I changed this piece of configuration. And the thing that I changed was basically the command timeout seconds. And I changed the value from 60 to 40 in between those versions. And now basically my solution would be ready to be deployed to, for example, test and start running perhaps an automated test scenario and onwards to production. And now the kind of solution starts taking on its own life cycle, where we start running through this process of developing, deploying, testing, developing, deploying, testing, and so on. But here was a brief overview and intro into what the Frends platform actually is, how does it work in its main principles, and a little bit of a demo on the monitoring and deployment capabilities as well. But now, unfortunately, Nando, I cannot now hear anything. So what I probably would have to do is I'm gonna disable my screen sharing here. And would we happen to have the chat here open, and I can probably read the questions from there myself from the questions tab.
There are no questions.
This is a little bit a little bit annoying because, like I said, I cannot hear you right now. But if we have any questions, please write them in the chat. Otherwise, I could hand it over back to Nando and Zico as well.
Well, we have a comment, and Peter Steenbergen says that he compliments you with a great user interface and the environment. And Aster Manhart, so you don't, yeah, says data is kept at Frends agent, so it does not have to leave the customer environment, but the data from within the process is also visible in the configurator monitoring. Can you hide sensitive data? So
Yeah, I think
maybe
we can probably put it in the chat. I think Osmo can read it then as well, and if not,
Yeah.
I can probably answer that as well. So I'll copy paste it, and then hopefully Osmo can give a comment on that.
yeah. So you see that the webinar software is almost as good integrated as Frends and Visma Connect, because you can answer live without hearing what we are saying.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that the questions are being answered. So, in regards to the question that Oscar mentioned about the data being kept at Frends agent, so it does not have to leave the customer environment, but the data from within the process is also visible in the configuration/monitoring. Can you hide sensitive data? And yes, you can control the logging for each step individual and also per field if needed. So that is an option, definitely.
Yeah. So Aster, I don't know. Does this answer your question? Yeah, clear. Thanks. So if there are no further questions anymore, I think we are going to close this webinar by thanking Asmo and Nando for their time. I think that Asmo still cannot hear me, but I wave to him and I say goodbye, Asmo. You are muted. Yeah. So thank you everyone who visited and joined us in this webinar, and thank you Asmo for being, or Nando for being here with us this afternoon. Recordings of this webinar will be sent to all participants and also to the people who couldn't make it today. And if you have any questions or all correspondence will be in the name of Nando, so you can reach out to him, and everybody will have his email address and phone number. Thank you for being here, and we are going to close this webinar.